The backstage area of the Metropolitan Talent Showcase smelled like a strange mix of hairspray, nervous sweat, and old carpet. It wasn't glamorous back here, not like what people saw on television. The walls were painted a dull gray, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that annoying way that makes you feel like you're waiting at the dentist's office rather than about to perform in front of thousands of people standing in the corner. Away from the clusters of chattering contestants was a woman who looked nothing like anyone else in the room. At 62 years old, she wore a simple cotton dress, the kind you might see someone wear to church on Sunday. Nothing fancy. Nothing meant to catch attention. Her hands, weathered and marked with years of work, kept fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Those hands told their own story. They weren't the smooth, manicured hands of the young performers around her. They were the hands of someone who had lived, who had worked, who had given most of her life to something other than fame. She clutched an old leather folder to her chest. The leather was cracked and worn at the edges, the kind of wear that comes from decades of use, not a fashion statement. Inside were sheets of music, some of them yellowed with age, corners folded from being turned too many times to count. Around her, the other contestants seemed to exist in a different world. Most of them were young, in their 20s or early 30s at most. They wore outfits that screamed for attention. Sequined dresses, perfectly styled hair, makeup done by professionals. They gathered in small groups, some warming up their voices, others practicing dance moves in the cramped space. Their energy was electric, a mixture of excitement and ambition that seemed to make the very air vibrate. A few of them glanced her way. Some did double takes, as if unsure whether she was a contestant or perhaps someone's grandmother who had wandered backstage by mistake. There were whispers, poorly concealed giggles, and knowing looks exchanged between the younger performers. One girl, who couldn't have been more than 23, leaned over to her friend and whispered something that made them both laugh. They weren't being cruel exactly, but their amusement was clear. What was this older woman doing here? The woman noticed, of course. It was impossible not to. But she didn't react. She'd spent 40 years teaching piano to children in a small town 3 hours away from this big city auditorium. She'd seen every kind of reaction a person could have. Doubt, dismissal, surprise, she'd learned long ago. That reaction said more about the person having them than about her. For 40 years, she had lived a quiet life. Every morning, she would open the windows of her small music studio, the one attached to her house, and prepare for her students. Children would arrive throughout the day, some eager, some dragged there by hopeful parents. Some genuinely talented, others just learning to appreciate that music could be more than noise. She had been patient with all of them. She had taught scales and basic chords, nursed bruised egos when performances didn't go well, and celebrated small victories. Like finally getting through a piece without mistakes. She had never performed publicly herself. Not once in all those years. Teaching was enough. That's what she had always told herself. Teaching was noble work. Teaching mattered. She could pour her love of music into young minds and hearts. And that would be her contribution to the world. But then her husband had passed away. Cancer? It took him slowly. Giving them time to say goodbye, but not enough time. Never enough time. After his death, as she was going through his things, trying to decide what to keep and what to let go, she found a letter. It was in his handwriting, sealed in an envelope with her name written across the front. Inside, he had written things he'd apparently been too afraid to say while he was alive. He wrote about the first time he'd heard her play. Really play. Not just teaching scales, but playing for herself. It had been late at night, and he'd woken up to hear music floating through their house. He'd found her at the piano, lost in the piece, playing with a passion and skill he'd never heard from her before. He'd stood in the doorway, afraid to interrupt, and just listened. The letter said he'd always wondered why she'd never shared that gift with the world. He understood that teaching was important, but he wished, just once, she would let other people hear what he had heard that night. The letter ended with a simple request. He asked her to perform just once, before it was too late. To stop hiding. To let the world see what he had been privileged to witness all those years. That letter had brought her here. to this backstage area with its fluorescent lights and nervous energy. It had pushed her to fill out the application, to submit the video audition, to drive 3 hours in her old sedan, to stand among people less than half her age who looked at her like she was lost. A production assistant walked by, clipboard in hand, checking off names and directing people where they needed to go. The assistant was young, maybe 25, with a headset and an air of busy importance. She stopped when she saw the older woman. "Are you a contestant?" the assistant asked, her tone suggesting she already doubted the answer. "Yes, I am," the woman replied quietly. The assistant checked her clipboard, running her finger down a list of names. "And you're performing today?" "That's right." The assistant's expression softened a bit, maybe feeling guilty about her initial doubt. "Okay, great. What's your talent? Singing, dancing?" "Piano." "Got it." The assistant made a note on her clipboard. "You'll be called in about 15 minutes. There's water over there if you need it. Restrooms down the hall, to the left. Any questions?" The woman shook her head. As the assistant walked away, the woman noticed more stares. Word was spreading in that weird way it does in small spaces full of anxious people. "The old lady plays piano. Can you believe it? What's she doing here?" A young man, mid-20s, with carefully styled hair and an expensive-looking suit, approached her. His smile was friendly enough, but there was something patronizing about it, like he was approaching a child. "Hey there," he said. "First time competing?" "Yes," she said simply. "That's awesome. Good for you. Seriously? It takes guts to get up there at any age." The way he emphasized any age made it clear he was really saying at your age. "What are you planning to play?" "I haven't decided yet." He nodded, that same patronizing smile fixed on his face. "Well, good luck out there. I'm sure you'll do great." As he walked away, she heard him mutter to another contestant, "Did you see the older lady? I mean, it's sweet that she's trying, but this is a professional competition." The woman took a deep breath. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. This was exactly what she expected. The doubt. The dismissal. The assumption that age meant limitation rather than experience. She thought about her husband's letter. Still folded in her pocket? She thought about 40 years of teaching. Of understanding music from the inside out. Of knowing not just how to play notes, but how to make them mean something. A voice called out from near the stage entrance. "Next contestant, please. You're up." The woman stood up, straightened her simple dress, and held her worn leather folder close to her chest. It was time to stop hiding. The stage lights hit her like a physical force. After the dim backstage area, the brightness was almost overwhelming. She had to blink several times before her eyes adjusted. The auditorium stretched out before her, rows and rows of seats filled with people. Thousands of them. Their faces were mostly hidden in shadow beyond the harsh stage lights, but she could feel their presence. Hear the rustling and whispers that filled the space. The grand piano sat center stage, black and gleaming under the lights. It was a beautiful instrument, the kind she'd only dreamed of playing. In her small studio back home, she had an upright piano that was older than she was. It served its purpose for teaching, but this was something else entirely. As she walked toward the piano, she became acutely aware of how she must look to the audience. Her simple dress, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her sensible shoes that squeaked slightly on the polished stage floor. She could hear the murmurs growing louder. The audience was confused. This wasn't what they expected from a talent competition. The judges sat behind their long table at the front of the auditorium. 3 of them, each famous in their own right. On the left was a woman in her 50s, a classical musician who had performed in concert halls around the world. She wore an elegant black dress, and her expression was neutral, professional. In the middle sat an older man, probably in his late 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a kind face. He'd been a music teacher himself before becoming famous as a composer. And on the right was the youngest judge. Couldn't have been more than 35. He was a pop music producer, the kind who worked with the biggest names in the industry. He wore an expensive suit without a tie, his hair styled perfectly. And he had that look of someone who'd seen everything and wasn't easily impressed. The younger judge. leaned back in his chair as she approached the piano. He glanced at his fellow judges and something passed between them. A look. The kind of look people share when they think they know exactly how something is going to go. She reached the piano bench and stood beside it, waiting. The stage manager had told her to wait for the judges to speak first. The younger judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His microphone picked up the sound as he cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice filled the auditorium through the sound system. "Well, hello there," he said. His tone was friendly enough on the surface, but there was something underneath it. Something that made it clear he was already making assumptions. "Thank you for coming out today. Can you tell us your name and where you're from?" She spoke into the microphone that had been positioned near the piano. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, amplified and echoing slightly. "My name is Helen. I'm from Millbrook. It's a small town about 3 hours from here." Millbrook, the younger judge repeated, nodding slowly. "And what do you do in Millbrook, Helen?" "I teach piano. 2 children, mostly. I've been teaching for 40 years. The female judge smiled at this. 40 years? That's wonderful. Teaching is such important work." "Thank you," Helen said quietly. The younger judge was still leaning forward, studying her with a look that might have been concern but felt more like condescension. "Helen, I have to say, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but you seem a little nervous. Are you sure you're ready for this? I mean, performing in front of thousands of people is very different from teaching in a small studio." Helen felt a flutter in her chest. Not anger exactly. She'd dealt with this kind of thing before. Parents who assumed that because she was quiet, she must not be very good. Students who thought her age meant she didn't understand modern music. She'd learned to let it roll off her back. "I'm ready," she said simply. The younger judge exchanged another look with his colleagues. The older male judge seemed slightly uncomfortable with where this was going, but he didn't interrupt. "Okay, well that's great," the younger judge continued. "Listen, Helen, we appreciate you taking the time to come here. We really do. But I'm going to be honest with you. This is a professional competition. The level of talent we see here is, well, it's extremely high. We have people who've trained at the best music schools in the world. People who perform professionally." Helen nodded, still standing quietly by the piano. The younger judge glanced at his notes, then back up at her. "What were you planning to play for us today?" Helen opened her worn leather folder. Inside were dozens of pieces, everything from classical compositions to modern arrangements. She'd spent weeks trying to decide what to perform. Something technically challenging to prove her skill. Something emotional to connect with the audience. She hadn't been able to choose, so she'd brought options. Before she could answer, the younger judge spoke again. "Actually, Helen, let me make a suggestion." He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something that probably thought was kindness, but came across as pity. "Maybe, and hear me out on this, maybe you could play something simple for us. Something easy that won't be too, challenging or stressful." The audience stirred. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, curious about where this was going. The female judge touched her colleague's arm gently. "I'm sure Helen is capable of playing whatever she's prepared." But the younger judge wasn't done. No, I'm thinking of her. I mean, Helen, you're what, 60-something? And you've never performed publicly before, right? The last thing we want is for you to get up here and struggle through something difficult. That wouldn't be fair to you or to the audience. So why don't you just play something simple? Something you're comfortable with. Maybe a children's song, since you teach kids? That way you can relax and enjoy the experience without the pressure. The silence that followed was heavy. The audience was no longer just curious. There was a tension in the air now. People could hear what was really being said. "You're too old. You don't belong here. Let's get this over with quickly so we can move on to the real talent." Helen stood very still. Her hands, which had been slightly trembling, went completely steady. She looked at the younger judge and her expression was calm. 40 years of teaching had taught her patience. It had taught her that the best response to doubt wasn't argument. It was demonstration. Something easy, she repeated softly. "Exactly," the younger judge said, seeming pleased that she understood. "Something in your comfort zone?" No need to push yourself. The older male judge leaned toward his microphone. Helen, please play whatever you feel is appropriate. We're here to listen. But Helen was already nodding slowly, looking down at her folder. Her fingers traced over the sheet music. Decades of practice making each piece familiar, even without seeing the notes. I understand, she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. You want something easy? The younger judge sat back, already reaching for his pen. The look on his face suggested he was preparing to write his comments, probably already formulating the polite rejection speech he'd give after she finished. He'd been through this before. Older contestants who didn't understand the level of competition they were up against. It was awkward, but it was part of the job. Better to let her play something simple, give her some kind words, and move on to the next performer. That's right, he said, his attention already drifting to his notepad. Just something simple. Helen closed her folder. She didn't need the sheet music. She'd made her decision. She moved to the piano bench and sat down. The audience watched, most of them expecting exactly what the judge had suggested. A simple children's song competently played, followed by polite applause and a gentle rejection. Helen adjusted her position on the bench. She took a slow, deep breath. Her hands hovered over the keys. Fingers curved in perfect form. The younger judge clicked his pen. Ready to write? The female judge watched with interest. Something in Helen's posture catching her trained eye. The older male judge leaned forward slightly, waiting, and in that moment, thousands of eyes on her and the weight of 40 years of hidden talent pressing against her chest. Helen spoke one more time. Of course, she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement. I'll play something easy. Her fingers touched the keys. The first notes were soft, almost delicate. They floated out across the auditorium like dandelion seeds on a gentle breeze. It was a simple melody, the kind that a child might learn in their first year of lessons. 3 notes up, 2 notes down, basic elementary. Exactly, the judges had asked for. The younger judge glanced at his notepad and began writing. His expression said everything. This was going exactly as he'd expected. A nice older lady playing a simple tune. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would advance her in the competition. He'd heard this same melody played by hundreds of students over the years. It was as basic as they came. In the audience, people shifted in their seats. Some looked at their phones. Others whispered to their neighbors. The initial curiosity about the older woman was already fading. She was playing a children's song, just as predicted. It was sweet, sure. But this was supposed to be a professional talent competition. Helen's eyes were open, focused on the keys. Her weathered hands moved with careful precision. The melody continued, simple and straightforward. 1 measure, then 2, then 3. The pattern was predictable. Anyone who'd ever taken a piano lesson would recognize it. But then something changed. It was subtle at first. So subtle that most people didn't notice right away. Helen's left hand, which had been playing basic accompaniment, added a note that wasn't in the original piece. Then another. The harmony shifted slightly, deepening. The simple melody suddenly had texture underneath it, like a painting that was slowly gaining dimension. The female judge looked up from her notes. Her trained ear had caught the shift immediately. Helen's right hand continued the melody. But now it was different too. The notes were the same, but the way she played them had changed. There was a roll to certain chords, a slight delay before others. The basic children's tune was beginning to breathe, to have life beyond its simple structure. The younger judge was still writing, but his pen had slowed. Now the left hand began to move faster. What had been basic accompaniment was becoming something else entirely. Complex chords replaced simple ones. The rhythm became more intricate. And still, the melody continued, recognizable but transforming. Like watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon, the audience stopped whispering. Phones were lowered. People who'd been looking away turned back toward the stage. Helen's hands were moving faster now. But there was no sense of strain or struggle. Her fingers seemed to know exactly where to go, as if they'd played this arrangement 1,000 times before. The simple song was expanding, growing, becoming something that none of them had anticipated. The older male judge removed his glasses and leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. The transformation wasn't just technical. Yes, the complexity was increasing with each measure. Yes, the arrangement was becoming more sophisticated. But there was something else happening? Something harder to describe? Helen was pouring emotion into every note. The simple children's melody, which had seemed almost childish moments before, was now carrying weight. It spoke of joy and sorrow, of years past and moments cherished, of simplicity found after complexity, of wisdom earned through experience. Her eyes closed, not from concentration or effort, but from immersion. She was no longer simply playing the piano. She had become part of the music, and the music had become part of her. The melody soared higher, the left hand creating a foundation that was both powerful and delicate. Scales ran up and down the keyboard at speeds that seemed impossible for those weathered hands. But they weren't just fast notes. Each one had purpose. Each one added to the emotional tapestry being woven across the auditorium. The younger judge's pen had stopped completely. He was staring at the stage, his earlier smugness replaced by something between shock and disbelief. Helen's whole body moved with the music now. Her shoulders swayed slightly, her head tilted. Every part of her was engaged in the performance. This wasn't the tentative playing of an amateur. This was mastery. This was decades of skill that had been hidden away, kept private, shared only with children in a small studio 3 hours from this grand stage. The arrangement shifted again. What had started as a simple, ascending melody was now a full composition, complete with dramatic crescendos and tender diminuendos. Her right hand danced across the upper register, while her left hand provided thundering bass notes that resonated through the floor of the auditorium. People could feel the music in their chests. A woman in the third row had tears running down her face. She didn't know why she was crying. The melody itself was happy, light, childlike in its origins, but the way Helen played it, the depth of feeling she brought to it, somehow reached past all the defenses people built up and touched something raw and real. The piece built and built, layers of complexity added on top of each other. Trills and runs and harmonies that shouldn't have worked together but did. Helen's hands were a blur now, moving across the keys with a speed and precision that contradicted everything the audience had assumed when she first walked on stage. Even the cameramen had stopped their usual routine. One of them, who'd been panning across the audience to capture reactions, had fixed his camera on Helen and wasn't moving. His job was to get multiple angles, but he couldn't look away from the performance happening in front of him. The song reached what should have been its conclusion. The simple melody returned, but now it was surrounded by everything that had come before. All the complexity, all the emotion, all the skill was woven around those basic notes that a child could play. Helen was showing them something profound. She was demonstrating that simplicity and mastery weren't opposites, that something easy could be played with complete dedication and depth, that the most basic elements of music, when truly understood and felt, could be transformed into something transcendent. Her hands slowed. The cascading notes became gentler. The thundering bass softened. The arrangement was circling back to where it began, but nothing was the same anymore. Those simple notes, which had seemed almost dismissive when the younger judge suggested them, now carried the weight of everything Helen had poured into them. The final chord hung in the air. Helen held it, sustaining the pedal, letting the sound fill every corner of the massive auditorium. Then, slowly, she released the keys. Her hands lifted. The sound faded gradually, naturally. Until there was complete silence, Helen sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. Her eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if she was returning from somewhere far away. The silence stretched. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire auditorium seemed frozen in time. Then someone in the back row stood up. Then another person. Then a whole row. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The applause started like thunder, crashing over the stage in waves. People weren't just clapping politely. They were clapping with their whole bodies, some raising their hands high, others bringing them together with force that must have hurt. The sound was deafening. It echoed off the walls and ceiling, bouncing back on itself until it was impossible to tell where one person's applause ended and another's began. Mixed with the clapping were shouts, whoops, cheers, the kind of reaction usually reserved for rock concerts, not piano performances at talent competitions. Helen opened her eyes. She looked out at the standing audience, and for a moment she seemed surprised. Genuinely surprised, as if she'd forgotten where she was, forgotten that thousands of people were watching. Her hands were trembling again, but not from nerves this time. At the judges' table, the younger judge was on his feet. His notepad had fallen to the floor, forgotten. His mouth was open, and he was shaking his head slowly back and forth, the way people do when they can't quite believe what they've just witnessed. The smugness was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The female judge wasn't just standing. She was crying openly, tears streaming down her elegant face. Her hands were pressed to her chest. She was mouthing words that couldn't be heard over the roar of the crowd. The older male judge stood more slowly, his wire-rimmed glasses in one hand. He was wiping at his eyes with the other. His face showed a mixture of emotions, joy, wonder, and perhaps a hint of regret, as if he was thinking about all the students he'd taught over the years, wondering how many of them might have had hidden talents they'd never shared. The applause continued. It wasn't stopping. Usually, at competitions like this, the applause lasted 15, maybe 20 seconds. This was approaching a full minute, and it showed no signs of fading. Helen stood slowly from the piano bench. She didn't bow or wave or perform any of the usual gestures performers make. She simply stood there, that same quiet dignity she'd carried when she first walked onto the stage. But something about her had changed. Or maybe nothing had changed, and the audience was simply seeing her clearly for the first time. Backstage, the other contestants were watching on monitors. The young man who'd wished her luck earlier stood with his mouth hanging open. The girl who'd laughed when she first saw Helen was now crying, her careful makeup running down her face. Every single person backstage, from the performers to the production assistants to the stage managers, had stopped what they were doing to watch. On stage, the younger judge finally managed to speak. He had to shout into his microphone to be heard over the continuing applause. He started, then stopped. He tried again. That was one of the most extraordinary performances I have ever witnessed in my entire career. The audience somehow cheered even louder. The applause finally began to fade, though it took nearly 2 full minutes for the audience to settle back into their seats. Even then, there were scattered bursts of clapping, as if people couldn't quite let go of what they'd just experienced. Helen stood beside the piano, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting patiently as she had waited for so many things in her life. The younger judge was still standing. He'd picked up his notepad from the floor, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Helen, and his expression had completely transformed. The condescension was gone. The casual dismissal was gone. What remained was something close to awe mixed with embarrassment. He spoke into his microphone, his voice noticeably different from before. Softer, more genuine. Helen, I need to apologize. When you walked out here, I made assumptions. Terrible assumptions. Based on your age, based on how you looked, based on everything except what actually matters, which is your talent. He paused, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up. I asked you to play something easy because I didn't think you could handle anything difficult. And you showed all of us, that easy doesn't mean simple. That a children's melody, in the right hands, can become something that moves thousands of people to tears. The audience murmured their agreement. A few people called out words of support. The female judge stood up, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. In my 30 years of performing and judging, I have heard some of the greatest pianists in the world. I've played in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo. I've accompanied orchestras and performed as a soloist for presidents and royalty. And she paused, looking directly at Helen. What you just did up there, that was beyond technique, beyond skill. What you showed us was something that can't be taught in any music school. You took something that we all know, something we've all heard 1,000 times, and you showed us its soul. Len's eyes glistened, but she remained composed. She'd spent so many years being the teacher, the one offering encouragement to others, that receiving it felt strange and overwhelming. The older male judge adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and leaned forward. His voice was gentle, like a grandfather speaking to a beloved grandchild. "Helen, can I ask you something? Where have you been hiding all these years? How is it possible that someone with your gift has spent 40 years teaching in a small studio and never performed publicly?" Helen looked down at her hands for a moment, those weathered hands that had just created magic. When she looked back up, she spoke into the microphone, her quiet voice filling the space. "I never thought I was hiding," she began slowly. "I thought I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Teaching felt important. It felt like enough. When you spend your days with children helping them discover that their fingers can create beauty, that they can express things through music that they can't say with words, well, that seemed like a worthy way to spend a life." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I grew up in a time when women like me, we didn't dream of stages and audiences. We were taught to be practical, to find our purpose in serving others. And I did find purpose. I loved teaching. I still love teaching." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "But my husband, he passed away 6 months ago, cancer. And after he was gone, I found a letter he'd written me. He'd never given it to me while he was alive. Maybe because he knew I wouldn't listen. Or maybe because he wasn't brave enough to push me." She reached into the pocket of her simple dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn from being handled many times, the creases deep. "He wrote that he'd heard me play once, late at night, when I thought he was asleep. He said he'd stood in the hallway and listened, and he wished, more than anything, that the world could hear what he heard that night. He asked me to perform just once, before it was too late." Her voice grew stronger. "So that's why I'm here. Not for fame or money or a career. I'm here because the man I loved for 43 years asked me to stop hiding. Even though I didn't realize I was hiding at all." The female judge was crying again. Several audience members were openly weeping. Even the cameramen, these professionals who'd seen hundreds of emotional moments, were having trouble keeping their cameras steady. The younger judge cleared his throat. "Helen, can I ask, that arrangement you just played, where did you learn it? Who taught you to transform a simple melody like that?" Helen smiled for the first time since taking the stage. It was a small smile, but genuine. "Nobody taught me. I've been doing it for 40 years. Every night after my students go home, I take simple songs, the ones I teach to beginners, and I play with them. I explore them. I find out what else they can be. It started as a way to unwind after long days, but it became something more. It became my way of staying connected to why I loved music in the first place." The older judge shook his head in wonder. "You've been creating these arrangements for 40 years? By yourself? And nobody knew?" "My husband knew. My students knew I could play, of course, but I never played like this for them. It wouldn't have been appropriate. They were there to learn basics, not to watch their teachers show off." She paused. "I suppose I thought that was all it was. Showing off. I didn't understand that sharing a gift isn't the same as showing off. My husband tried to tell me that in his letter, but I think I'm only now beginning to understand what he meant." The audience erupted in another round of applause. This time it was different. Not the thunderous standing ovation of before, but something warmer, more personal. It was the sound of thousands of people saying they understood. They saw her. They recognized something in her story that touched their own lives. The younger judge looked at his fellow judges. They nodded at him. He turned back to Helen. "Helen, I think I speak for all three of us when I say that you are moving forward in this competition, unanimously, without question. What you did today was important. Not just as a performance, but as a reminder to everyone watching that talent doesn't have an expiration date, that we should never make assumptions about what people are capable of based on how they look or how old they are." More applause. The younger judge held up his hand, indicating he wasn't finished. but I also want to say something else. What you told us about teaching, about finding purpose in helping children discover music that's not less than performing, that's not hiding. I was wrong to imply that. Teaching is how music survives. It's how passion gets passed from one generation to the next. You've probably influenced hundreds of students over 40 years. Some of them might be teachers now themselves, passing on what you taught them. That's a legacy that matters more than any single performance ever could. Helen nodded slowly, and for the first time, her composure cracked just slightly. A single tear rolled down her cheek. The female judge spoke again. Helen, I have a question. All those arrangements you've created over the years, have you ever written them down? Recorded them? Shared them with anyone besides your husband? Helen shook her head. No, they were just for me. For my own enjoyment. I never thought anyone else would want to hear them. The three judges looked at each other again. The female judge leaned into her microphone. Well, I think today proves that assumption was incorrect. Very, very incorrect. The audience laughed and applauded again. The older judge added, Helen, what you've shown us today is that mastery isn't about playing the most complicated piece or the most technically difficult composition. Real mastery is understanding music so deeply that you can take something simple and reveal its hidden depths. You've reminded all of us, especially those of us who teach or judge or critique music for a living, what really matters. It's not about impressing people. It's about moving them, about connecting with them, about showing them something true. Helen stood quietly, absorbing their words. She looked different now than when she first walked on stage. Not physically different, but there was something in her posture, in the way she held her head, that had shifted. It was as if a weight she'd been carrying for 40 years, a weight she didn't even know was there, had been lifted. The younger judge smiled, a real smile this time, nothing patronizing about it. Before you go, can I ask one more thing? Do you have any advice for the other performers here today? Or for the young musicians who might be watching this? Helen thought for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice clear and strong. Play with love, always. Whether it's the simplest scale or the most complex concerto, play it like it matters. Because it does matter. Every note matters. Every song, no matter how easy, deserves to be played with your whole heart. That's what I've tried to teach my students all these years. And that's what I hope I showed you today. The applause that followed was the longest yet. The audience stood again, but this time it felt different. Less like celebration and more like gratitude. As if everyone in that auditorium understood they'd witnessed something rare. Not just a beautiful performance, but a moment of genuine truth. Helen picked up her worn leather folder from the piano. She gave a small nod to the judges, then to the audience, walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity she'd carried when she arrived. But everything had changed, and everyone knew it. Helen drove home that night expecting nothing to change. She'd performed just as her husband had asked. She'd honored his memory and stepped out of her comfort zone. That felt like enough. The competition would continue, and whether she advanced further or not didn't really matter. She'd done what she came to do, but she'd forgotten about the cameras. And she'd forgotten that in this modern age, nothing stays private for long. By the time she pulled into her driveway in Millbrook, her performance had already been uploaded to the internet. The production company always posted highlights from auditions to build interest in the show. They'd posted a 2-minute clip of Helen's performance, expecting it might get a few thousand views from loyal fans of the show. Within 3 hours, it had 1 million views. By morning, it had 10 million. By the end of the week, the number had climbed past 50 million and was still growing. Helen didn't know any of this at first. She didn't spend much time on the internet. She didn't have accounts on social media. The next morning, she woke up, made her coffee, and prepared for her first student of the day, a 7-year-old boy named Tommy who was still learning to read basic sheet music. Her phone started ringing before Tommy arrived. Then it rang again, and again. She didn't recognize most of the numbers, so she let them go to voicemail. When she finally checked the messages, there were dozens. News stations wanting interviews, talk shows inviting her as a guest, music labels asking if she'd be interested in recording an album. She thought it was some kind of mistake, or maybe a scam. People didn't call elderly piano teachers from small towns to offer them recording contracts. But then her neighbor knocked on her door, her laptop in hand, nearly shouting with excitement, "Helen, you're everywhere. You're on every website. Everyone's talking about you." That's when Helen finally understood. Her neighbor showed her the video, showed her the millions of views, the hundreds of thousands of comments. People from countries Helen had never visited were writing about how her performance had made them cry. Musicians with famous names were sharing the video and talking about her technique. Music teachers around the world were showing the clip to their students as an example of what dedication and passion could achieve. The comments went on forever. This made me want to start playing piano again after 20 years. I'm 65 and I thought I was too old to pursue my dreams. Not anymore. Who's cutting onions in here? This is what real talent looks like, the way those judges underestimated her. And then their faces when she played. Perfect. Helen sat in her small living room, staring at the laptop screen, completely overwhelmed. Her hands were shaking. Not from nerves this time, but from the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. 50 million people. 50 million. She'd spent 40 years playing for an audience of one, herself, late at night when everyone else was asleep. And now, somehow, the entire world was watching. Tommy's mother called to reschedule his lesson. She'd seen the video too. "Helen, I think you might be a little busy today," she said, laughing with delight. "We're so proud of you." The competition continued over the following weeks. Helen advanced through each round. Her performances were different from the other contestants. While they played classical masterpieces or modern pop arrangements, Helen continued to do what she'd always done. She took simple songs, children's melodies, basic tunes that everyone knew, and transformed them. Each performance showed the audience something new, revealed another layer of depth in music they'd heard 1,000 times, but never really listened to. She didn't win the competition. That honor went to a talented young vocalist with an incredible range and stage presence. But somehow it didn't matter. Helen's journey had become about something bigger than winning. She'd become a symbol, a reminder that it's never too late. That age doesn't diminish talent, that the quiet gifts we keep to ourselves might be exactly what the world needs to hear. The offers kept coming. A major streaming service wanted to produce a documentary about her life. A publisher wanted her to write a book. Concert halls were inviting her to perform. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exciting all at once. But the offer that caught her attention came from an unexpected place. A nonprofit organization that promoted music education reached out with a proposal. They wanted to create a scholarship fund in her name. Not for young prodigies or virtuosos, but for older adults who wanted to return to music. People who'd set aside their instruments decades ago to raise families or build careers. People who thought their chance had passed. Helen loved the idea immediately. She used the prize money from the competition, along with earnings from a few select performances she agreed to do, to establish the fund. Within months, hundreds of people had applied. A 60-year-old grandmother who'd played violin in high school. A 73-year-old man who'd always wanted to learn the saxophone but never had time. A 58-year-old woman who'd set aside her guitar when she became a mother and hadn't touched it in 30 years. The stories poured in, and each one reminded Helen of her own journey. All these people who'd been told, either directly or indirectly, that their time had passed, that music was for the young, that dreams had expiration dates. A record label eventually convinced her to record an album. She was hesitant at first. Recording seemed so formal, so permanent. But they let her do it her way. She recorded in a small studio, just her and the piano, playing the arrangements she'd developed over 40 years of late-night sessions. Simple songs made extraordinary. Children's melodies transformed into profound musical experiences. The album was called Simple Things. It wasn't marketed to young people or pop music fans. There were no flashy music videos or publicity stunts. It was just Helen playing piano, demonstrating that beauty doesn't require complexity. To everyone's surprise, except maybe Helen's students, who'd always known she was special, the album became a phenomenon. Not in the way pop albums do, with chart-topping singles and radio play, but it sold steadily, week after week, month after month. People bought it for their parents and grandparents. Music teachers assigned it to their students. Hospitals and nursing homes played it in their common areas. It became the kind of album people put on when they needed to remember that the world could be beautiful. But through all of this, through the fame and recognition and opportunities that would have seemed impossible a year earlier, Helen kept teaching. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, students still came to her small studio. She still taught scales and basic chords. She still encouraged frustrated children who couldn't get their fingers to do what their minds wanted. She still celebrated small victories and nursed wounded pride after rough performances, because that was the real revelation. The thing she'd tried to tell the judges on that stage, performing was wonderful. Recognition was validating. But teaching, helping others discover their own voice through music, that was where the real magic happened. One Tuesday afternoon, about 6 months after her audition, a woman in her 60s showed up at Helen's door. She was holding a violin case, the leather cracked and worn, clearly decades old. "I saw your video," the woman said, her voice nervous. "I played violin in college. I was pretty good, actually. But then life happened. Marriage, kids, career. I put it away and told myself I'd get back to it someday. That was 35 years ago." Helen smiled, that same warm smile her students knew so well. "And now? Now I'm 59 years old, and I watched you walk onto that stage. I watched those judges assume you couldn't play. And then I watched you show them what 40 years of hidden passion looks like." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "If you can do that at 62, maybe I'm not too old to try again?" Helen opened her door wider. "Come in. Let's see what that violin remembers." That moment, more than any performance or album or award, felt like the real point of everything that had happened. Her story hadn't just entertained people or impressed them. It had given them permission. Permission to try again. Permission to be beginners at 60 or 70 or 80. Permission to believe that the dreams they'd set aside were still waiting. Patient and possible. The documentary eventually aired. The book was published. Helen performed at a few select venues, always choosing smaller, more intimate spaces over grand concert halls. She liked being able to see people's faces, to watch the moment when a simple melody shifted into something more in their expressions, changed from casual interest to wonder. But her favorite moments remained those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in her small studio, teaching 7-year-olds how to hold their hands, explaining why practicing scales mattered, showing them that every song, no matter how easy, deserved to be played with complete attention and care, because that's what her journey had really taught her. Not that she should have been performing all along, not that teaching had been a waste of her talent, but that teaching and performing weren't opposites. They were two sides of the same thing. Both were ways of sharing music. Both were ways of showing people that beauty existed and that they could create it themselves. Her husband had been right. She had been hiding in a way. Not from the world, but from the fullness of what she could offer it. Teaching was enough. But teaching and sharing, that was better. That was complete. Late at night, after her students had gone home, Helen still sat at her piano. But now, when she played, she didn't think of it as something private anymore. She thought of all the people who'd written to her, who'd told her that her story had changed them. She thought of the 60-year-old grandmother learning violin again, the 73-year-old finally picking up a saxophone, the 58-year-old mother rediscovering her guitar. She played for them. She played for her students. She played for her husband, wherever he was, hoping he could hear and know that she'd finally understood what he'd been trying to tell her, and she played for herself. For that girl who'd fallen in love with music so many years ago and had never stopped loving it, even when she thought love was enough, without sharing, the world kept turning. New viral videos replaced hers. Other stories captured people's attention. But the ripples from that single performance continued, spreading outward in ways Helen would never fully know. A woman in Tokyo started painting again after decades away from her easel. A man in Brazil began writing poetry. A teenager in London realized that the adults in her life weren't done growing and changing. Helen had asked for something easy, and she'd shown the world that easy and extraordinary weren't opposites. That simple things, approached with mastery and love, could change everything, and that some gifts are worth sharing, even if it takes 62 years to find the courage